Welcome to Syncreate, a show where we explore the intersections between creativity, psychology, and spirituality. We believe everyone has the capacity to create, and our goal is to demystify the creative process and expand the boundaries of what it means to be creative. I'm Melinda Rothaus, and I help individuals and organizations bring their dreams and visions to life. At Syncreate, we're here to support your creative endeavors. So if you have an idea for a project or a new venture, please reach out to us for one-on-one coaching. So today I am so very excited to have my friend, colleague, and collaborator, Jennifer Leigh Selig, with us today. And Jennifer is the founder of Mandorla Books, which is actually the publisher of our Syncreate book. It's an award-winning press, including our book, which won a Silver Nautilus Award for creativity and innovation. She's the author and/or editor of a dozen books, and she was the founding chair of the DEPTH Psychology and Creativity Master's degree at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California. She now teaches and presents extensively, both online and across the country, focusing on memoir writing. So she has a new book out, which we'll be talking about today, called Deep Memoir. And she's also the co-author of another book called Deep Creativity. And both of these books bring an archetypal and depth psychological perspective to the creative process. So that kind of brings us to our topic today, which is creativity and depth psychology. Depth psychology being kind of a Jungian approach to psychology, archetypal psychology, really looking into kind of the deeper meaning of things and all kinds of fun stuff, which we're going to hear more about. So, Jennifer, so glad to have you here today.
Melinda, it's such a joy to be with you again.
Yes, I love it. And so just a little background on how we know each other. So we actually met through the Young Society of Austin, where I was a board member for several years. And we've collaborated in various different capacities over the years. And you recently were back in Austin. You're based in California, but back in Austin at the Young Society for a presentation and workshop on the 7 stages of the underworld journey. And unfortunately, I was not able to be there, but
I know, I was so disappointed.
I know, and it sounds so fascinating. So I want to kind of bring this to our listeners and our audience. And I think maybe a good place to start with this, I want to get into the juicy details, but what is this underworld journey from a depth psychological and archetypal perspective for those who may not know?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, my background is in Jungian and archetypal studies, as you mentioned, and that's just inherently interested in the underworld journey because, as you know, it's part of our individuation journey as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So something happens that kind of drop kicks us out of our everyday egoic lives. We descend into the darkness, we confront our shadow. And if and when we ascend, because it's an if and when we ascend, we come back with some creative gold, or what Joseph Campbell called the boon for ourselves and our community. So that's basically an underworld experience. They include things like divorce, breakup, illnesses, accidents, diagnoses of all kinds, losing your job. I mean, there's no end to the underworld experiences, including collective underworld experiences like the pandemic, like what we're going through right now in Israel and Gaza. There's so many events we go through together as a culture as well as individually.
Yes. So this is kind of the prototypical dark night of the soul. We hear about the underworld in different myths and stories across cultures, but really this is a real life experience that we each encounter inevitably going through life.
Sometimes many times in a life. Sometimes we're
Yes.
born into an underworld experience.
Yes.
But if we
Right.
live life for any period of time, even if we had the best of childhoods, we're going to be in the underworld.
Absolutely. And, you know, according to Jungian and depth psychology, it's actually from these experiences, you know, these kind of crises or this kind of suffering that we actually learn and grow the most, or at least we have the potential to.
The potential to.
The potential to.
That's why
Y-
I say if and when we ascend, because some people
yes.
don't make it out of the underworld. Some people
Hmm.
succumb to addiction, to suicide, to, to a life of depression, to, inability to, uh, inability to live life to the fullest. There's all sorts of ways we don't always make it out of the underworld. And I always think it's important to say that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'm curious to hear more about these 7 stages, both just, you know, if we can, I have found it in my personal experience, if I can kind of understand um, the nature of these journeys, these experiences, then I feel a little bit better equipped to navigate them
Mhm.
when they inevitably occur.
Mhm.
Right? And so
Yeah.
you've kind of mapped out these 7 stages. So I'd love to hear more about those. And also, how does this relate to creativity?
Yeah, good. So what when I came up with these stages was I've been teaching memoir writing primarily for the last 7 years.
Mhm.
And so many of my students come in, probably 85% come in to write an underworld story or at least
Uh-huh.
have an underworld component.
Yeah.
And many memoirs are memoirs about trauma as well. So
Mhm.
it's a well-worn path. But when I looked at examples of the journey, the structure of the journey, the archetype of the journey, I couldn't find anything that really talked about what is it like when you're in the underworld? What do you go through in the underworld? Other than it's a dark night and then you ascend. There's not much out there about that. So I wanted to
Mhm.
help my memoir students kind of with a schema or a map of the underworld to look at
Yes.
how they could talk about their journeys and how other people have talked about theirs. And I just love what you said right there because this is an archetypal approach, which looks at
Yes.
universal patterns, right? So
Yeah.
I think there are patterned experiences in the underworld. And once you know you're living inside of a pattern, that many people before you have lived through, people are living through now, and people will live through forever. It makes you feel less alone in your own particular journey. So that's
Yes.
kind of the impetus to come up with these particular stages is to say these I call them actually sometimes I call them the 7 stations of the cross
Yeah.
of our own underworld journey, right? So they
Yeah.
go all the way back to Jesus, and they're all throughout mythology. So in my book on Deep Memoir, I connect each one of these stages with particular myths, cross-cultural myths of the underworld journey.
Yeah, and I just want to say, you know, again that because these are sort of universal experiences, we see them in, you know, different myths and different stories across cultures, and that's precisely why these stories, these myths have such resonance, right? Because
Exactly.
they can actually be viewed as a map of some sort to our own experiences.
Exactly, exactly, and it really connects to what you're talking about with Syncreate, which is that, the intersection between creativity, spirituality, and psychology,
Yeah.
because this is maps like these are transpersonal, meaning they cross cultures and times, right? You can
Yes.
find them in the earliest myths, and you can find them in the most contemporary memoirs. So, yeah, so that's really what I've been looking at.
Great. So take us through kind of what are these 7 stages
Yeah,
about?
I will. I'm gonna take you through them without talking about the myth because the myth would take too much time to talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
But I just wanna say for anyone who's interested in connecting it with the myth, you can, you can get my book, Deep Memoir, but you can also I assume in the show notes, you can put my website. You guys can your
Absolutely.
listeners can connect with me on the website,
Oh, for
and I'm
sure.
happy to send you guys anyone who wants the chapter in the book that talks about these so you can see why they're connected. Because some of the titles I'm gonna say about the stages may not make a lot of sense unless you understand the myth that it's connected to. So,
Got it.
but
Got it.
let me move through them and then we can
Yes,
talk about them.
please.
Okay. So the first one I call Love's Failure Against Death, which is about, it kind of begins with our inability to stop our descent into the underworld. And by love, I
Mm.
mean, our will, our capacity, our hearts, our souls. We cannot stop our descent. Something's out of our control, circumstances are happening to us. As I said, it might be an unexpected diagnosis, a sudden car accident, a spouse or a partner wanting to divorce or separate, a depression that swallows us up, and then also, as we saw, a global pandemic that falls upon us, and we're in failure to stop this thing from happening as much as we want to. And in this stage, we really experience this almost complete sense of futility. There's nothing I can do, and human beings don't like to be out of
No,
control.
we do not enjoy that experience.
Not when it's negative, maybe when it's
Right.
positive.
Right.
Yeah. So after that's the plunge into the underworld, and after we're plunged into the underworld, the second stage I call the backwards glance, which is
Yes.
when we can't stop looking back at what we lost or what life used to be or what life could have been had this experience not happened. And it's a place of not being able to really accept what has been done or what has been done to us or what we've done to ourselves, because sometimes, through our own faults and failures, we plunge ourselves into the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a stage where we're really feeling grief for what's lost. And this is the stage where we do a lot of, what if, what if, what if, what if?
Yeah.
What if I had eaten healthier? What if, what if I,
Mm-hmm.
all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's a stage where if we've been betrayed, we're unable to forgive and forget. So we're just stuck looking backwards, which means we can't move forward.
Yes, that is so important because often it's so much easier to see, what we're losing. And then it's like, I went through this because I had a surgery recently, which I talked about in a previous episode, where it's like there's this event horizon and you can't see beyond it. You can only see, what are you losing or what are you afraid
Yes.
of or whatever.
Yes.
And you can't see beyond into the potential of the future at that point.
Yes, exactly. And then I don't know if you did this with your diagnosis, but then sometimes people will just be like, what could I have done to have stopped this from happening before? Right?
Right.
You're just so
Right.
stuck in the past.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
really difficult phase there. So the third stage I call stripping of the self. And that, if you know the myth of Inanna, you'll understand this, but Inanna goes through these 7 gates of hell and gets stripped in every single gate. So this has to do with everything we lose when we're in the
Mm.
underworld,
Yeah.
which could be, just to name a few things, like we can lose our money, we can lose our careers, we can lose our homes or possessions. We can lose our reputation. We can lose our dreams for the future. We can lose family, loved ones. We can lose our physical or mental health. So it's about what's being taken from us.
Yeah.
And those are physical things, but also in this stage, we might suffer from psychological losses as well. The
Yeah.
loss of innocence, the loss of a feeling of being in control, the loss of self esteem, the loss of our pride and dignity, and during this stage, as it was in the myth of Inanna, our losses may compound. So it's like one thing after another as we're in the underworld.
Yes, and they often do seem to stack up in
Yes.
strange ways, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Particularly, I always talk about how there are smaller underworld dips, where you just go in for a while and come back out. But in the deep
Mhm.
ones, there tends to be a compounding of losses.
Yes. Yeah, and that can be so disorienting, right? And just kind of paralyzing
Mhm.
also.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there are things we can anticipate and things we cannot as
Yes.
as we're in those losses, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fourth stage I call lost and wandering, and that's really out of when I looked at the myths, there's oftentimes a sense of timelessness in the underworld that
Yes.
time stands still, and what we do is we just wander around sort of dazed and confused,
Yeah,
like what's
right.
happening, right? And we wonder,
Yeah.
are we going to recover? Are we going to get out of this? Is life ever going to change? And certainly during the pandemic, we all felt this lost and wandering, right? Like,
Oh,
how much
yes.
longer is this going to go on? And then these
Yes.
moments of hope that were then that were then rescinded by, well, back in lockdown again, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So during this stage, we sometimes for people that it's a very suicidal place where, like, we wonder if we even
Mm.
want to live or we want to die. Are we just can we get back to a state of normalcy at all? And also we
Mhm.
may really withdraw from the world.
Yes.
And again, using the pandemic, I saw that happen, but I also know with personal underworld experiences, a lot of times we withdraw, we kind of curl up inside of our mourning,
Mhm. Mhm.
and kind of sometimes disappear into a shell of ourselves as we're just trying to protect ourselves from everything that we've lost.
Yes, yes, and sometimes, I mean, that can be, just as you say, a type of protection. It's just like a necessary survival mechanism,
Mhm.
right? As long as we don't stay there.
Yeah. When it's such a state of disorientation, because 'cause we're like, "What
Mhm.
just happened?" Particularly if it's a sudden loss, a sudden
Yes,
underworld experience.
yes.
We're like, "What happened, and how do I move past this or move out of this?"
Mhm.
Certainly, I love to look at memoirs because I teach memoirs, and those of you who know Cheryl
Yeah.
Strayed's memoir,
Mm.
Wild,
Yes.
the lost and wandering that she did while she was doing the hiking on the Pacific Crest
Yes.
Trail, even though she's literally lost sometimes, but she's
Mhm.
also like, "How do I survive the death of my mother? How do I survive my addiction?" All of this. So we can
Mhm.
see these patterns, inside of memoir as well as myth.
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
And I should just say here that these stages are not necessarily sequential. I put
Mhm.
them in a sequence that makes the most sense for how I see people living them. But, if anyone's working with these stages, you might find that you went in and out of different ones. You might find you were in 2 or 3 on any given day.
Mhm.
So they're not necessarily sequential, and you might not have gone through all of them, but I've done this with about 80, 90 students and workshop participants, and it's
Mhm.
kind of amazingly accurate about how people move through these things once you kind of slow down and
Yes.
dive in.
Yes.
So I call the next step the remembering, and
Mhm.
that's where we try to gather what it is that we lost. We try to
Mm.
get back to something. So
Mhm.
we remember our beloved, we remember our relationship, we remember our job. This is a stage where we might create a memorial or
Mm.
memorialize what it is that we've lost.
Mhm.
We might turn to a creative act like writing.
Yes.
Obviously, for you, songwriting as well.
Mhm.
Photography, I know you do. We
Mhm.
might scrapbook. What we're trying to do in this stage is say, yes, this thing is lost, but let me remember it before it's
Yes.
completely gone.
Mhm.
Um, it sometimes comes with a state of nostalgia, this idea of nostalgia, memorializing, I'm sorry, what's been lost. And so I can
Yes.
give an example of just recently I lost my beloved grandmother. She was 102 and I had her my entire life. And after she died, I knew I needed to memorialize her in some way for myself, beyond,
Mhm.
a memorial service. And so I took
Mhm.
3 days away by a beautiful body of water, and I brought all of her photographs, all of her, um, everything that she had saved for herself, and I went through document by document, piece by piece, and read about her life, looked at her life to really memorialize her in that way, and it was a very important stage for me in my own, grief cycle.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
And that you mentioned that, it strikes me as I'm listening the parallels to both kind of the hero's journey, right?
Mhm.
But also the stages of grief.
Yes. The stages of grief are the only, when I was looking at all these journey structures and none of them really talked about what this is like,
Mhm.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief were
Yeah.
the closest thing that I could find,
Yeah.
to that. But she doesn't talk about necessarily I mean, she talks about acceptance, but it's sort of a loose map
Yeah.
onto the stages of
Yeah.
grief for sure. But there are definitely parallels inside of that.
Yeah.
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 So then 2 more, The sixth one I call following the thread,
Mm.
which if you know the myth of Ariadne and Theseus, it comes from that, which is that we find a thread that leads us out of the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
The thread could be a person. It could be a
Yeah.
therapist. It could be, a 12-step sponsor. It could be an animal. It could be moving someplace beautiful in nature. It could be a
Mm-hmm.
trip we take, some travel we do. I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking of another popular memoir of Elizabeth Gilbert in Eat, Pray, Love. The thread that
Yes.
takes her out of her grief around her marriage dissolving is traveling
Yes.
to the 3 countries she travels to. And this is a stage where we really begin, we begin to see the light. Like we're kind of at the bottom and we can look up and we can see the light.
Yes.
And, our grief or our anger, our futility kind of loses its hold on us.
Mm-hmm.
And usually, you talk about where creativity plays a part. Creativity plays a big part in this particular stage. But
Yes.
sometimes when we're in the underworld, we're not creative. And so our creativity is muted or dampered. And sometimes the only thing that is the thread to get us out is just time. The
Yes.
idea of time heals all wounds, just
Mm-hmm.
time passing and life carrying on. We sort of shrug off this underworld experience we've had. But certainly, for your audience and for us, creativity is one really great thread out of the darkness.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then I'll just do the last one, and then
Mm-hmm.
when we can talk about them more. But the last one is very similar to Joseph Campbell's last stage in the hero's journey, which is the gifts of the underworld.
Yes.
And this idea that we return from our underworld experiences. If we make it out, we can return with any number of psychological gifts. Like we can become more mature, wiser, less egoic, less innocent, more soulful, humbler. There's all sorts of gifts that we can get psychologically, but also sometimes physically. We
Mm-hmm.
might bring things out from the underworld, like, better health, better habits. I know I fell in love during the pandemic, so that was a gift for me of the underworld experience
Absolutely.
was being able to
Yes.
fall in love in the way that I did. And certainly for all of us who are creative, one of the gifts of the underworld is that we come out with our creative gifts. We come out with material. We come out with songs to sing, writing I came out of a bad underworld experience with a screenplay. So
Uh-huh.
we take our experience and we metabolize it and we
Yeah.
alchemize it, and we turn to our creativity. So
Yeah. Yeah. So this is so interesting because I teach a course for Saybrook University on creativity, individuation, and depth psychology. And you mentioned individuation earlier, which essentially, I sort of boil it down to this journey to wholeness that
mhm,
takes place across the span of a lifetime. And to me, how that relates to creativity is that individuation and this journey to wholeness has so much to do with meaning making, and I know
yes,
you talk about that in your
yes,
book, right? And that creativity, creative work is a beautiful way to make meaning of our experiences in, all the ways that you just said.
hmm
I know you also talk about expressive writing, right? Which is just this idea of like getting whatever it is out of our head and out of our body and onto the page. And that can be very cathartic. But I think that holds true for, any type of creativity, any medium, whether it's
hmm
painting or dance or music or whatever it is, but that we can use these tools of creativity to kind of make sense, make meaning of our experiences, reflect upon them, grow from them.
yeah, and make beauty from them.
Yes.
One of the
Yeah.
one of the stories that my co-author, Deborah Ann Quibell, tells in Deep Creativity is about a man who was wheelchair bound. I think it was a brain injury, and he painted this mural on the wall of his as he was having to get up into his home. on the ramp, he created this beautiful artistic mural to remind him of beauty in that sense. And I think that's so important as well. And I don't know if we talk about beauty enough when we talk about underworld experiences. And certainly
Hmm.
I haven't talked about it in the work I've done, but I know that's really important. And of course, as a songwriter, you understand that you make something beautiful from your underworld experiences.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I think this kind of there's also a connection between, kind of these seven stages that you're talking about and the notion of archetypes, which
Mhm.
we've touched on in a previous episode, episode 23 with Stephanie Crane. We were talking about corporate personas and sort of
Mhm.
archetypes in the corporate world. But more broadly, archetypes are kind of these universal structures, right? That we can connect with in different ways, maybe at different times in our lives, in different contexts. And again, they have this universal quality to them, but we also experience them in a very unique and specific
Mhm.
way. So, how does this notion of archetype relate to these stages of the underworld journey?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So everything I do, the whole lens through which I see the world is an archetypal lens. So
Yes.
you know this because one of the experiences we had together was we were looking at the archetype of longing at the
Yes.
Austin Young Friends, and I
Yeah.
would talk about an archetypal longing, and you would sing a song that
Yes.
represented that longing. It was such a great
So much
experience.
fun.
I teach a
Yeah.
course on spiritual writing where we look at spiritual archetypes. Like, what is the way we connect with spirituality? That's an archetypal way. There are certain pattern ways that we connect. Some people connect through nature. Some people connect through art. Some people connect through community. So I'm always wanting to look at the archetypal aspects of it. And so whenever you go into myth, you're going into archetype because you're looking
Yes.
at patterns that have always
Yes.
existed that we as human beings are still doing. So,
Mhm.
when I call it the backward glance, that stage there, that's Orpheus and Eurydice. That's
Yes.
Orpheus backwards looking at his wife. He can take his wife out of the underworld if only he doesn't look back at her, and he fails, he looks back, which is also the myth of Lot and his wife from the Old Testament, right? So
Yes.
these have always been happening. So when we spend time obsessing about the past, wanting to look back at the past, we are no different than these people, these stories that have come, far before us, and again will go on far after us.
Yes.
Right? So there's gonna be nothing new under the sun. There's gonna be unique stories, but they're all gonna fit in my thinking as an archetypal psychologist. They're all gonna
Mhm.
fit in certain sorts of patterns. And when we
Yes.
sing a song, when we write a book, when we do a painting that's on an archetypal theme, we increase our resonance with our audience, right? So one of the things that I have heard is that the Madonna child painting is the most popular archetypal painting in the world. Well, the mother
Interesting.
child,
Of
right? What
course.
else?
Of
What
course.
else is there gonna
Right.
be?
Right.
Right? So as long as we keep telling, mother child stories, we are
Mhm.
always gonna have an audience for that. We are always gonna have an audience for grief. We are always
Yes.
gonna have an audience for lost love, all of
Yes.
those. So I think the more we're aware of the archetypal patterns or buckets we're filling, or choose your own metaphor, the more
Mhm.
our work is going to resonate.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. So I think that's a great segue into your new book, Deep Memoir. And I was actually listening to another podcast that you did recently talking about the book. And this is a book about craft, about the
Mhm.
craft of writing memoir. And, memoir is such a popular genre these days. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit more. I took a memoir workshop with you a while back where we
Mhm.
worked with different archetypes, and it was so interesting because what I found is that I've always thought about writing a memoir, but I've never actually tried it. But in the class, you gave us different writing prompts, and then
Yeah.
just something to start from. And I found that I was recalling these experiences from my childhood that as I started to write, I started to remember more and more vivid detail that I wouldn't necessarily have just been able to call up. But somehow that act of writing and like trying to envision all the sensory details and the felt sense of the experience, all of a sudden it came flooding out, and it was so rich, right? So I think that this idea of like working with these archetypes is so potent. So
Mhm.
tell us more about how you work with memoir writers specifically.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And yeah, and again, it's the book is for memoir writers because that is where I've been teaching mostly, and I wanted to
Mhm.
use a lot of examples of memoir. I actually have 140 plus memoirs I discuss in the book I
Wow.
reference.
Yeah.
So it's about that, but I would say it's more than that. I think it could be useful for anyone who's storytelling because the
Yes.
idea behind the book, I can quote a friend and a colleague of mine, Dara Marks, who calls
Mhm.
story the human
Yes.
instruction manual.
Yes.
So we've always learned through story.
Mhm.
So, and one of the ways we learn through story is learning through pattern stories.
Yes.
We learn about love, death, grief, all of
Mm.
that through
Mm.
story, through music, through art, etc. Right? So if you're thinking, I want to make a contribution to the human instruction manual, how do you do it?
Yes.
And one of the ways you do it is you search for the universal in
Mhm.
your own personal story.
Yes.
Right? So it's about my own experience, but it's also about our experience. And if you look at my
Yeah.
cover for Deep Memoir, you'll see what I mean by that, that there's one circle that's my story and one circle that's your story. And then in the center where they intersect, it's our story, right? So
Yes.
what is our collective human story? So why do
Mhm.
things touch us so deeply from other artists? They touch us because it speaks to our own particular story as well. And so
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do in the book. It's called Deep Memoir because that is where I'm working right now, but I do think
Mhm.
it's also just deep storytelling. I think it can apply to a lot of different genres of work. Just like, where can someone find themselves in your work? Where do we intersect, right?
Of course. And, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders and, obviously the fields of marketing and branding all focus also on storytelling. It's funny because I was looking online for some images of, archetypes and, hero's journey and things like that for my class. And it's really interesting how the kind of marketing world has embraced the
Mhm.
notion of archetypes and kind of the hero's journey as a storytelling mechanism. So yeah, there's all
Mhm.
kinds of applications beyond, memoir or writing or, we're always telling stories. And that's
Right.
also how we just, again, make sense of our experiences and our
Yeah.
lives.
And I would just
Yeah.
go back to something you said in the beginning, which is that understanding that we're not the first person to live this story
Yes.
is really helpful. Of
Yes.
course, it's incredibly all everything is unique about our story and everything is universal about our story. And when
Yeah.
we feel like part of the collective, part of the human experience, part of I am just one person undergoing this sort of transformation that has happened before, happens now, will always happen. I do think it makes us feel less alone, more a part of the
Absolutely.
human experience.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful. So this is a great kind of segue because I like to end each episode with a creativity pro tip, I call them. And, something that people can go out and try and do on their own. So I think a great pro tip here is to really consider, are there certain archetypes or stories or myths that feel particularly resonant? And, think about your favorite songs or your favorite books or
Mhm.
films or whatever. They all have this archetypal quality. And then see if you are, working on a creative work, how could you more intentionally incorporate that in order to, bridge the personal to the universal and thus,
Mhm.
be able to reach people and touch people's
Yeah.
hearts.
I love that. And can I add one more angle
Of
to that?
course,
Okay,
yeah.
so in my chapter on the archetype of meaning, I talk about the fact that, okay, if story, and everything is story creative, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Music, art, everything is a story. So
Yeah.
if story is the human instruction manual, the way that we
Mhm.
learn how to human,
Mhm.
then we all have wisdom to add to that human instruction manual. We all have a
Yes.
page, right? And
Yes.
so one of the things I find my memoir students reluctant to do is actually own their wisdom. And so
Yes.
there's a Mary Oliver poem that I have. It's a very brief, it's a section of a poem that I have in the book, which
Mhm.
she says, instructions for living a life.
Yes.
And it's just 3 little lines, but it's about being amazed and telling about it. And so I ask my students, like, what have you learned about life that you want to tell about it? So in your creative work, what is your wisdom that you want to add to the human instruction manual that you have learned as a result of living your life? And so it's another thing to do. It's just to write down, what do I know about life? What have I learned about life? And how can I
Yes.
incorporate that in the creative work that I do? How can I convey that? Not like a hard hitting, self-help to do necessarily,
Yeah.
although you can do that too.
Yeah.
But how can I bring out what I have learned in the hard ways from the underworld experience or, in the upper world experience? How can
Yeah.
I bring that forward? So
Yeah. No, that's so
mhm,
important. I'm so glad you said that because actually in the episode that came out last week, which was episode 37, Charlotte and I were talking about this very thing about, we may not realize that we have something to share.
mhm,
Because it might just seem second nature or obvious or whatever to us.
mhm.
But maybe it's not obvious to everybody else, and maybe it could help someone. Maybe we could be a mentor or a guide to someone else simply by sharing our story.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
With always an eye toward the universal, always the
Yes.
eye toward how is this going to resonate with other people? What do I have to offer to other people? What's my hard-earned wisdom? And that's
Yes.
the underworld experience, right? What's my
Yeah.
hard-earned wisdom?
Exactly. And we
Yeah,
all have it.
we do.
Yeah.
We do.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I love this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
yeah, so if people want to find out more about you, about Mandorla Books, about your classes, workshops, presentations, how can they find you?
Yep, they can find me at my website. It's jenniferleeselig.com. You will put it in your show notes, so I won't
I
have to spell
will.
that all out for you.
Yes.
So
Yes, for
come on over
sure.
to a website, sign up for my mailing list. Again, if you want the chapter on the underworld experience with the myths,
Mhm.
just email me and I'll send it right out to you. So,
Okay.
yeah, thank you, Melinda. It's been wonderful.
Perfect. Find and connect with us at syncreate.org. We're also on YouTube, social media, and Patreon. If you are enjoying the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. And we're recording today at Record ATX Studios in Austin with Jennifer Selig in California. The podcast is produced in collaboration with Mike Osborne at 14th Street Studios. Thanks so much for being with us, and see you next time.